But we do start tonight with the long-awaited deal on road funding that's now awaiting Governor Snyder's signature. The agreement will eventually, and that's the key word, eventually, pump $1.2 billion a year into fixing the state's crumbling roads. But that's not until 2021. In the meantime, the state will begin to shift up to $600 million a year from the general fund to help with the repairs. Here are the details for you. The state gasoline tax will rise by 7.3 cents per gallon beginning in 2017. For diesel fuel, the tax increase will amount to a little over 11 cents per gallon, and registration fees for passenger vehicles and trucks will jump by 20%. The plan also calls for a couple of tax relief components to benefit residents. But overall, is this a bad deal for anyone who drives in Michigan? And that's where we start our conversation tonight with our contributors Nolan Finley from the Detroit News. Stephen Henderson is off tonight, and sitting in for him is Nancy Kaffer from the Detroit Free Press. All right, guys. Nancy, it's good to see you. Welcome back to MiWeek.
Thank you for having me.
All right, in order to celebrate not only Nancy being here, but also the fact that we have a roads deal, the finest champagne that PBS could buy are inside these mugs here today as we celebrate the roads deal, right?
That's not true.
That's not. Thanks, Nolan. Thanks for playing along as usual.
I was told there would be champagne.
Exactly. I feel like the show is off to a rip-roaring start so far.
Not true.
All right, so let's get into the roads deal. Since you're in such a good mood today, I'm going to start with you, Nolan. Is this a good deal?
It's the best deal they could get. So in that sense, it's a good enough deal. I mean, this, if you put it in the context of the environment in which it was passed, the opportunity for a great deal, or for a really good road deal, passed last fall when they failed to do it in the lame duck session and kicked it over to voters in the form of Prop 2. And the overwhelming, Prop 2, Prop 1, what was it?
It was Prop 1.
Prop 1. But the overwhelming defeat of that in the spring, I think, eliminated the possibility of getting getting this thing done right. I mean, you had lawmakers scared to death to do an all-tax deal. You just had some thinking that you shouldn't do any deal at all because the voters had spoken. So when you think about 4 years of standoff, you finally got a deal that will provide some money for roads. It's not perfect by a long shot. It's not even really good by a long shot. But it's good enough, and I think it was the best you could hope for.
All right, so good enough, yeah. When I was reading the details of it, I kind of went, eh. So Nancy, what would your first just gut reaction? Is this a good deal?
I would agree that it's probably, I wouldn't even say the best deal that we could get. I'd say maybe the only deal that they could get. The thing that particularly troubles me is that half of the revenue to pay for roads comes from new revenue, the gas tax, the registration fee increase. The other half comes from this prospect of shifting $600 million, which actually grows to $800 million by 2021 out of the general fund. That's a lot of money. It's going to be about 7% of the general fund by the time we get to hit 2021, and it's $806 million. That's not like change that's in the sofa cushions. This is stuff that's going to come along with real cuts to services. The governor believes that economic growth is going to balance that out. I think we are predicted to have economic growth. Forecasts get wobblier the further out they go. And we also know that there are some cost factors out there that are going to gobble up a lot of that growth, like having to pay more for our share of the Medicaid expansion, other things with unemployment and more public assistance cases. I mean, there's stuff out there that's going to eat up that growth.
Yeah, so is it really two things? Is this a bad gamble or a very risky gamble, Nolan, in terms of thinking, well, yeah, the state is going to do better by X amount of time, and the fact that no one knows where the cuts are going to be coming from the general fund.
Well,
what services or what things could be cut?
I mean, that's where the cowardice was in this thing. It pushes those hard decisions off to people who aren't in the legislature today and aren't in the governor's office. This deal counts on the longest sustained economic recovery since World War II. I think between now and 2021, the prospect of an economic downturn is pretty high, pretty realistic. I think that roads should be funded by user fees, the way we've always funded them. Gasoline tax, fuel tax, and registration fee. And I can't for the life of me figure out why these lawmakers felt it's okay, there's less risk in raising it 7 cents than raising it 15 and getting the whole thing done through user fees. Once you've raised the tax, I mean,
someone can say you voted for raising a tax.
And so no matter what happens with gas prices now, as soon as they spike, people are going to say, that's because of the gas tax. So you might as well have gone in whole hog. You're going to take a hit anyway. And the other thing about it is postponing the benefit so long. You've raised the tax, and people aren't going to see a real difference in terms of road work for 4 or 5 years to come. And so people are going to be out there saying, look, I'm paying all this more money for gas taxes and my roads are still lousy. I think the politics of it didn't make sense.
The politics didn't make sense. The timing doesn't make sense. Go ahead, Nancy.
They can theoretically borrow against the new revenues, but they can only borrow against the $600 million that's coming from
Not a
fees.
significant amount of money.
They can't borrow against $600 million in theoretical cuts. Like, that's just not something the bond market is going to go for. So
All right,
and plus, I mean, by raising registration fees, now every year people are reminded that their taxes went up. If you just put in a straight fuel tax at a time when gas is what, $2.20, $2.19 a gallon, people would have grumbled for a few weeks here, and then it would be, the natural scope of thing. We're still $1.50 cheaper than we were at our high point.
let's talk a little bit about the timing. The fact that it's not rolling out until 2017, and and again, the full effect of a $1.2 billion to fix the roads, Nancy, is not coming until 2021. When the reality is, the price tag for roads is probably going to be much higher by that point as well.
No, there's that too. We've talked about how the roads are getting worse every month we delay, every winter we delay. I mean, the only question here, I think this is the only deal they could get. But would it have been better to say, hey, we're not doing a roads deal right now because we can't get a reasonable deal? I don't know that was been a palatable solution either. But in effect, it's almost like we have no roads deal for the next couple of years. So it's a real bizarre situation.
Well, I mean, it's next year. I mean, in fiscal year 2016, the money's already in the
before the
budget.
full
But in
amount
17, I mean, you do start to get some revenue from this thing coming in 17, revenue that you can spend, and it also takes some pressure off the general fund budget in 2017 because it pulls out that $400 million that was in this year. The problem is you're not going to see any real significant improvement in roads for a long time. And meanwhile, I mean, they're not just going to remain the way they are. They're going to keep getting worse.
They're going to keep getting
By
worse.
spring, they're going to be miserable.
What I think is also interesting too is we are also counting on lawmakers that we don't maybe even know yet, and we haven't even elected yet, who are going to be making these decisions about cuts and about funding. So everyone who made the decision this week, in a couple years from now, a lot of them might be gone.
Yeah, I think they will be gone, the majority of them. And this is another interesting thing about this is the current legislature, binding a future legislature to its will is not something that always works the way they intend it to.
You wrote a column a couple days ago, Nolan, saying that basically Snyder had to go in and bust up some kneecaps to get this deal done. Do you feel that he did that this week and he should come out of this as a good victory for him, that he was able to round the troops up, or what do you take away from that politically?
It's a minor victory for him, and no, I don't think he ever did do that sort of hard sell, hard pressure. He didn't get what he wanted in this deal. He got some of what he wanted. The governor wanted a straight user fee, pay for roads, leave the general fund alone, and that's the way it should have been. But, I mean, this falls on him in a lot of ways. He should have never allowed that proposition to go on the ballot this spring. He should have held this over, walked away from it last fall, and started over with the new legislature and not tied their hands with that awful proposal.
Nancy, you made an interesting point that, this is the deal that just kind of had to get done. People have been so disappointed with lawmakers in Lansing. They've been disappointed with Congress as well, but that's an entirely different conversation. But do you believe that this maybe takes off the heat that people say, well, at least they made some kind of decision, or are we still going to hear the drumbeat for, hey, part-time legislature, we need to change the system?
I don't know that this actually does make people happier with the legislature because, yeah, they got a deal done, but it's a deal that I think all of us are in agreement is a really problematic deal. And the coverage of this deal is reflecting that. When they got the Prop 1, they came to agreement on Prop 1 and put that on the ballot, that didn't mollify voters. In fact, it seemed to enrage them because they shot it down by an enormous margin. I mean, I don't really know who this benefits politically because it, as Nolan said, there's still a tax increase. For people who care about that, that's a huge problem. There's going to be service cuts. That's a huge problem for people who care about that. I mean, it seems like you can please some of the people some of the time. This seems like pleasing none of the people none of the time.
And that's right, because the legislature really couldn't win here because there was a strong contingent of folks who believe that, well, we pay as much in gas taxes as everyone else. Why are roads so lousy? Why should we have to pay more? There was others who said, hey, we decided on this in May. We said we didn't want this. And there's a whole lack of trust in the highway department as well. People don't believe the roads are getting fixed right. Nothing the legislature could have passed would have helped them.
But then you also have House Speaker Kevin Cotter, who believes that there's waste that can contribute a lot to getting rid of $600 million from the general fund.
Well, how come they haven't found it before, I guess?
$600 million is a lot of money. We're not talking about 10 million or 20 million. We're talking, this is a lot of money. And so you have someone in the leadership who's propagating this idea that maybe cutting $600 million is not such a big deal, which he spoke with the absent Stephen Henderson on the radio last week and seemed to really think that money you put into services wasn't going to be touched by this, or that they could move some stuff around and everything would be okay.
Well, you can do a little of that. I mean, you could cut $500 million out of corrections in a very short time with common sense sentencing reform.
But that is going to require a lot more than that's not just a across the line
cut. There's a strong
cut.
contingent that is opposed to.
This is going to force people to make really difficult choices about that sort of thing. I don't think we can keep spending $2 billion a year.
Yeah, but what we've seen so far is the legislature is not really, they're not really wanting to make these difficult decisions.
And every dollar you spend has a constituency in the legislature, and this is going to have to force them to make some hard choices. And the easiest place to get this money is common sense sentencing reform. We lock up too many people. We cut the prison population by 25–30%. You save $500 million. Well, you're a long way towards your savings then. But we've been resistant to doing that.
So all right, last word, Nance.
Good news, everyone. Gear up for another 4-year fight on sentencing reform, is I think what Nolan's forecast.
I really do think there's a movement.
Make me start sweating, for heaven's sake.
There's a movement toward sentencing reform, both at the state and federal level. I think that's going to happen, and I think you can get considerable savings out of that.
All right. Well, we'll have to see what happens there in the next couple of weeks, and especially as Lansing starts to tackle Detroit schools.